Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. The HiT cast offers a weekly look at Hollywood from a conservative point of view. Sick of media bias infecting Hollywood headlines? Tired of stars insulting your views? HiT has your back. Now, here's your host, Christian Toto.
Welcome to episode 17 of the Hollywood in Toto podcast. This week's interview is with the founder and driving force behind the cutting-edge film site FilmThreat.com, Chris Gore. But before our chat, I wanted to take on a recent article posted at Salon.com. The article's headline sets up the whole purpose and the snark. A mea culpa to Hollywood conservatives living under the shadow of a modern McCarthyism. It's all about the recent claims that Hollywood has a new blacklist, and something, frankly, I've covered quite a bit at Hollywood in Toto, looking at conservatives who can't really speak their mind without suffering some form of punishment. That could be being ostracized, it could be losing gigs, it could be worse, frankly. It is a true story, and there are lots and lots of anecdotes. And the funny thing is, every few years ago, some of the reporters who cover Hollywood actually tell the story. Most recently, it was at the LA Times, where the reporter did a pretty good job talking to different conservatives, finding out what the scoop is, and also learning that, hey, a lot of people really like to hide their political views if they're right of center because they don't want to get punished in Hollywood. Of course, the Salon.com article takes that and says, well, it wasn't exactly like the blacklist. It wasn't as harsh as that. People didn't go to jail. And you know what? That's true. It wasn't as harsh as the blacklist of yore. And that was a terrible thing, which we've spoken about again and again on all sides of the ideological aisle. But that doesn't take away the fact that there's some really bad things happening in Hollywood now when it comes to free speech and free expression, and the fact that conservatives just can't be who they are without suffering some kind of punishment. And that is just flat out wrong. So the Salon.com article wants to kind of push that aside and say, hey, never mind that. We want to make fun of the fact that it's not a direct comparison and use that as our cudgel against the argument. Well, it doesn't wash. And let me tell you why. First of all, I have some firsthand examples of this where people really did fear a backlash just for being a certain way or even working a certain way. And one of the examples actually happened very early on my website. I talked to John Sullivan, who's the director of 2016 Obama's America, and he told me something chilling that really wasn't picked up in the media, frankly, beyond what I wrote about at the site. He said that people on his crew, some of them wanted to use pseudonyms rather than their real names while they were working with him. Now, they wanted to work with John and they enjoyed the project and they had no problem with that part of it. But they knew if you went to IMDb and you saw his or her name on there, they may suffer some consequences being in Hollywood working for a decidedly right-of-center movie like 2016. So they worked under pseudonyms. What does that tell you? I spoke a few months ago with Heather McDonald, who is sort of a right-of-center comedian. I don't think she's overtly so. She's more of a kind of a gossip teller, a little bit bawdy at times. She was on Chelsea lately for a while. And she said, too, yeah, boy, if you want to vote for Donald Trump, you may be in trouble in Hollywood. And I don't think she was really trying to stir things up. But frankly, she brought up the subject directly when we had that conversation. So another anecdote about what's going on. And of course, every year there is a story like the LA Times piece where, hey, conservatives don't get a fair shake. They have to be quiet. They have to work underground. They fear repercussions. This isn't a new tale. It's something that has been going on for quite some time. And I think there's another example that really kind of hammers home the point here. When you think about Hollywood and fundraisers and cocktail parties and kind of getting the cash together for the Democrats, you read about it all the times. It's in Deadline.com. It's in The Hollywood Reporter, Variety. George Clooney opens up his home for a swank affair, raising money for President Obama or Senator Hillary Clinton or something like that. Hey, it's perfectly fine. It's their money. It's their homes. They do what they want. You know what conservatives do? They meet in secret. Friends of Abe is a society where conservatives get together, share stories, share horror stories, I imagine, as well, and they work under the radar. Now, the group itself has been written about in recent years, and there was rumors, maybe it's a reality, that they've actually broken up and after the rise of Trump kind of caused a fissure within the organization. But the bottom line is that they don't want their membership ranks revealed. Sure, there are a few people who talk about it a bit, And there's always a John Voight in the realm, or even a Kelsey Grammer who's openly conservative and still gets work. But there clearly are people who fear their livelihood may be jeopardized just by being right of center, just by being conservative. That's flat out wrong. So you can deliver all the snark you want, Salon, but the reality is there's a real problem in Hollywood, and I'd love to see a George Clooney or a Meryl Streep talk about that the next time they get on their soapbox. So far, I haven't heard a word. Now I want to go with a hit tip of the week, and this one's what I want to call a perfect streaming choice. Now, it's not a perfect movie. It's not even a great movie. Some could argue it's not even a good movie, but you know what? It's exactly the kind of movie that I search for on these streaming services. Now, it is a low-profile film. I hadn't heard of it until I found it on Amazon Prime, and didn't know any of the actors in it. Hadn't heard a thing about it until I kind of clicked on it and started checking out. It's called Thirst. And the title isn't exactly original, and the story isn't super original. It's about a bunch of people being attacked by this monster and trying to survive. Now, that sounds as generic to the core, and there are certainly elements here that you've seen a million times before, but there are a couple of wrinkles here too. One, the special effects are pretty good for a low-budget film. I was impressed. And a lot of the action happens in the daylight. Often these films happen at night, so you can't see sort of the bells and whistles and realize how bad the FX are. Not here. I don't know what exactly the models that were used, or the stop motion, or the CGI, whatever that works, it works well enough to convince you there's a really menacing threat out there, and certainly good enough to be enjoyable. Also, the setup here is a little bit interesting. It's about a group of teenagers. Yes, they're annoying. Yes, they're young. Yes, they're often beautiful, but they're gathered together because they're misfits. They've been kind of put into this boot camp of sorts because they've been so bad with their parents. They've had enough. They want to kind of send them out into the wilderness to kind of set them straight in a sense. Of course, the moms and dads didn't expect the monster to be lurking in the midst, so a little bit of a problem there. But just the setup itself, kind of novel, and it also helps explain why they're, frankly, are hateable at times, because these kids are really rough around the edges, and they've got a lot of entitlement, and that kind of feeds into the whole horror movie trope of the people who kind of don't mind if they get taken out by the bad guy. But you know what? There are some likable characters here as well. Some of the problems I had with the film, a couple of the more interesting characters exit stage right early on, way too early, frankly. I think it hurts the movie. And again, special effects are certainly not world-class, and the predictability of the story does weigh in at times. But you know what? It's a pleasant surprise on a streaming service. It's available now on Amazon Prime, and it's called Thirst. So if you're a horror movie fan, check it out. Sometimes when a movie delivers on a low-ambitious project, it's even better. Now let's get to this week's interview. Chris Gore started Film Threat in the 80s as a movie fanzine. The publication has gone through many changes over the years, and in recent times it actually went dark for a while. But now it's back following a successful crowdfunding campaign. I talked to Chris about that history, his thoughts on the current movie scene, and the impact a single film site can have on the Hollywood system. You'd be surprised. A quick note, the recording software hiccuped on me early in our chat, so I had to stop it and then restart again. So you're going to have a kind of a rough spot in the audio. I apologize for that, but couldn't be helped, and I want to make sure I kept this all the information possible in the chat. So here's my interview with Chris Gore of FilmThreat.com. Well, first of all, I love sort of the backstory behind this, and sort of you were a young man, you started a zine, as they call it. Can you talk a little bit about those early days and what memories kind of really pop for you all these years later?
Well, I think some of my greatest memories of doing Film Threat at the beginning was the fact that everything was so difficult to achieve. Back when I was going to see films, I mean, you had to, like, if it was a retrospective screening of, say, a John Waters movie, you had to find out where it was playing. You had to go to that. You know, it wasn't an easy thing. You had to travel far to actually see films, in addition to just ordering them on VHS tape and then putting together the magazine itself. I mean, it was a physical thing. It's not like a blog post where any of us can just type and click, and then suddenly it's posted, you know, for the world to see. I mean, it was an arduous process of setting type, you know, getting linotronic, and actually physically cutting and pasting the printed out words, and then we would use wax on the back to post on pages, and then take it to a printer. It was so inefficient when I think back that I actually prefer today. Like, you know, like I prefer web publishing to actual physical publishing, because physical publishing had so many additional steps to getting information to a reader, right? So
yeah.
Between all of that, putting the magazine together and then sending the magazine out, and then crossing your fingers, hoping the person that you're targeting and who may be interested actually discovers the magazine. That was such a difficult thing to do.
It's funny you just brought back memories. When I used to work at my school newspaper in college, we did the same thing. We'd print out the paper with story and then run it through this waxer machine, and it would put like a waxy surface on the back of it, and then we'd adhere it onto the I don't even know what you called it back then, but you kind of stoked that memory for me. And back then, if I knew that in 30 years we could push a button and have everything sort of shared with the world, I think I'd be stunned, but that's where we are now. Now, obviously, you're much older now, and the site and the magazine has gone through so many twists and turns, and we'll link to some of that on the show notes. But talk about the original mission and how it sort of evolved over the years as opposed to where you are today in 2017.
Well, the original mission was to champion independent films, which at the time that Film Threat launched, independent films weren't even called independent films. That wasn't a name that was commonly used. It wasn't a genre. So the purpose was to champion champion independent films and make fun of Hollywood movies. So we did our best to kind of lampoon Hollywood, sort of mock the ridiculousness of the Hollywood establishment. So mocking that, and then additionally just championing the indies as they came to be known in the 90s. That was Film Threat's mission. And, it doesn't matter what incarnation. I mean, the magazine was a fanzine on Xerox. It was printed on newsprint. Then we got a little slicker. And then the magazine became a website in 1996. But at every stage, those are really the things that Film Threat did. Film Threat was all about finding some no-name filmmaker, from wherever, Austin, Texas, and writing about their movie, right? Like, I remember getting a VHS tape from this filmmaker named Richard Linklater from Austin, Texas. This was like maybe 1988, 89, and it was a movie called Slacker, and I remember just being blown away by that film. And it was on VHS, and it was 10 minutes longer than the version that, eventually got theatrically released. So, it's really amazing that, like, today now the way I find out about a new filmmaker is I'll get a Vimeo link with a password, All filmmakers now, Vimeo is sort of the filmmaker's digital showcase of choice. So that's how I see a lot of new work by indie filmmakers is here's my Vimeo link, here's a password, look at my movie. But God, filmmakers back then, they had to make copies of their movies on VHS or on DVD and mail them, cross fingers, we would see it.
That's amazing. Now, I know along the way the publication worked with the Larry Flint Empire, and I'm just kind of curious, were there any sort of interesting stories from that sort of partnership, or was it just another business endeavor that, played its course?
I mean, for most part, it was a business endeavor. I think that they really didn't understand Film Threat or care. They just knew that it sold a certain amount, and they left us alone for the most part. I mean, I'm shocked at what we were able to get away with in the magazine. Pretty incredible. But yeah, no, that was fun. I mean, it was the only time Film Threat really had a budget. Even though the budget was the lowest budget of any magazine at the company, we still had something of a budget to work with, which I'd never had before. Which was a lot of fun. And also, we would use resources. In fact, I still think I have office supplies from my days there, because I used to take home office supplies. But no, that was a good partnership at the time. It was a way to get. But Film Threat's appeal wasn't as broad as they would have liked. You know what I mean?
Gotcha.
And the magazine industry went through in the late '90s a paper crisis. So in the paper crisis, paper prices just went through the roof at that time, and it put a lot of alternative press magazines out of business, and we also were a victim of that paper crisis.
Gotcha. Now, obviously, when you started out the publication, you were critical of Hollywood and sort of more mainstream movies, and I'm sure there's a million reasons why you're still critical of mainstream movies today. Break it down a little bit. What's going on with the product today? I mean, we could point to the 10 poles. We can talk to you got to appeal to all four quadrants. What's, from your perspective as an industry analyst for all these years, what's happening in theaters? Why is the product what we're getting, and why is it sort of been dumbed down to the extent it is?
Well, Well, I'll be really blunt. Audiences are dumber. They're just not as smart as they used to be in the 70s. They're not looking for experiences that are challenging. They're seeking out things that, for the most part, are comfort food movies, right? So that's why, well-known franchises tend to do so well at the box office. It's really about tentpole franchise movies. In fact, Francis Ford Coppola calls it factory filmmaking.
Uh-huh.
That's what he calls movie studios now. It's all about brands, right? I mean, Marvel and Marvel superheroes are a brand. Star Wars is a brand. It doesn't mean that within that space you can't also make a good film, but for the most part, it's just factory filmmaking. I mean, it's difficult to point to any of the major studio releases. They're all based on either a franchise that's been around for decades, a pre-existing property, either a play or a book. There's hardly any original films. All of original filmmaking is kind of migrated to indie. So it's a double-edged sword. There's sort of good and bad parts. I mean, look, movie theaters, the attendance is actually decreasing year after year. Hollywood likes to report that numbers are up in terms of dollars, but the truth of the matter is fewer people are going to the movies than ever. And if you look at a lot of these, like, now they're trying to expand, which I think is fine. They're trying to expand the experience where it's, dinner at a movie.
Uh-huh.
So you've got chains like the iPick or ArcLight where they include food, or you can bring alcohol in the theater, which I think is smart. But look, if you look at the digital services, there are more ways for indie filmmakers to get their movies out. You can have your movie for sale on iTunes or on Vudu or on platforms like VHX, or you can even sell your movie on Vimeo. So there's good and bad parts. Yes, the sort of bad, sameness of the studio movie still exists, but I like to think that, and I like some of those bad popcorn movies, but I think it's important as a moviegoer to have a balanced diet,
Yeah.
So for every Rogue One, you have to see Manchester by the Sea, or something like that. I think it's important to have that kind of diversity in your media intake, right? You can't, too much of one thing isn't good, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's with anything, it's like, too much of like MSNBC or CNN is not good. You got to balance it out with a little bit more, you know what I mean? Like, spread the love around in terms of like where you consume your media, and that goes for film and news and all that stuff.
Yeah. There are obviously a lot of movie websites, and if you look on your Facebook page, you'll find people weighing in on what they thought of the latest movie. What challenge does that give you? You've got this new reborn website, but there's so many people kind of opining about movies these days. Does it make you kind of want to zig when they zag? I mean, or is it all about sort of sticking to your purpose, and if other people emulate what you do, all the better?
Well, I think that, see, that's the thing. It is a challenge. I will say that there are more outlets covering movies today than there are movies being made. So it's challenging to stand out, and anyone can do a review of, say, Rogue One. Anyone can do that. You can even post one on your Facebook page for others to see. What I try to do with Film Thread is make it unique in the sense that, yes, we'll review Rogue One, but maybe not in the same way that you would have expected, right? Mm-hmm. Or you're also, if you spend some time on Film Thread, you're going to discover films that you would not have discovered had you not just gone to filmthread.com. So while we've got, reviews of the latest releases, there's also content on there you won't find anywhere else. So I think that's the way that we stand out, because for the most part, the Hollywood entertainment journalism elite are controlled by the studios, who are basically spoon-fed press releases. So what I've always, challenged myself to do is to go beyond the press releases and look at just your regular filmmaker who's very passionate, who sends me a link and says, "Here's my movie." I'm willing to pay attention to those people, whereas a lot of the major film sites do not. So,
gotcha. Over the years,
if you look around, our content is unique in that way.
Gotcha. Over the years, have you had issues where you tried to either ask a question of someone with some notoriety and got kind of shut down by the PR people? Or has there ever been sort of real tension there? Or do you generally kind of avoid the Tom Hanks types because you know that might be an obstacle?
I don't know necessarily shut down. I mean, we've been like, Warner Brothers for years will not, because we crashed the set of Batman Returns back in the 90s.
Uh-huh.
And to this day, Film Threat is not invited to any Warner Brothers movies.
Wow.
So, boy, yeah, look, Hollywood people, they hold a grudge.
That's amazing.
Uh-huh. It's pretty crazy. So, but not shut down. I mean, pretty much like it's not about being shut down. It's more about not being, not given access.
Yeah.
But to me, it's like, okay, how is my 4-minute Tom Hanks interview going to be different than the other 30 or 40 that he did? What's he going to say? You can't really get into too much depth in a 4-minute conversation.
Gotcha.
Which is most of that television coverage. So what I look for is like, well, let's go in depth with the people that'll talk to us. Let's go in depth with, this new breed of filmmaker. With the tools now, I mean, you can make a feature-length movie on your iPhone. You can shoot it. In fact, the new iPhone 7, if you get the 7 Plus, it shoots 4K native. It looks incredible. It's got a dual lens. You can sit there with an iPhone. You can make an entire feature film, edit it, and complete it, and upload it from your phone. It's really, the tools we have now are incredible.
It's amazing. Through the years, obviously, you like to push buttons, and there's controversy about what you write and some of the positions you may take. Talk a little bit about that and sort of the art of being controversial, because I think when it's inauthentic, people sense it, and you don't always want to kind of stoke those fires. I think there's sort of a burnout factor, but I think I get the sense you kind of work that balance between being true to yourself and also saying what you want to say. Is that something that you need to kind of grow into as a journalist?
Well, first of all, I think that, there are 3 things you need to actually write about film or entertainment in terms of entertainment journalism. One, you need to have a grasp of grammar. You really do need to get one of those Sprunken White books and just be good at grammar. 2, you need to have passion, right? So there's a lot of passion on the internet. And 3, you need to have a sense of film history. And I think that that's not something you can do necessarily at the beginning, because you could say, for example, that Sausage Party by Seth Rogen, the animated film of last summer, is the funniest movie I've ever seen. But if you told me that, I would think to myself that you hadn't seen a lot of movies. So I think that it's important to have a sense of film history. So grammar, passion, history, I think are the 3 things that you need. And I think that there's a lot of passion. There's not a lot of grammatical correctness, and then the sense of film history, which is, I think, your seasoned film critics know. They can really put things into perspective, or as compared to, or this is, they can draw comparisons with films from early film history. So, most people that are passionate about movies really only know movies from the last 5 years. If you reference a movie that's more than 5 years old, you're running the risk of losing a younger audience, which I'm happy to do, but I think it's important for people to be educated. Yeah.
When you look at your fellow critics, what jumps to mind for you? And I'll throw out something that I tend to see. I kind of think there's a groupthink going on. There's sort of trends where it's almost like a momentum shifts or surrounds a particular film, and then all of a sudden the narrative builds up. And I think a lot of times critics might kind of go to that as opposed to being a little bit more independent. What's your perspective on critics today? I mean, what are they doing right and what are they doing wrong?
Well, the one thing is the sense of film history, I think, is something that needs to be ingrained more. I think that a lot of the critics that I've observed are just, some of them get involved in a lot of things that are just kind of petty. For example, seeing movies first, or a little, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of rivalries and fights that people get into that are really over nothing.
Yeah.
They're really over status. So those are people I think people that treasure status, as a film critic, I don't take those critics very seriously, because obviously they're focusing on the wrong things. I really don't care. I'm happy to be a part of, I feel very, very privileged and lucky to be able to do this work. Like this is, I mean, I get to do something that's a fun job. You know, it's not coal mining, right? You know, this is something I get to do. Like I feel grateful. So anyone that you know, I just don't. The thing is, I don't pay a lot of attention to the complainers.
Gotcha.
So or like the infighting that occurs between critics. You know, there's a lot of elitism and a lot of just like, you know, my opinion's better than your opinion. And you know what, you know, I actually, the one thing that I do enjoy is I like to read someone whose opinion differs from my own. Mm-hmm. Because if all I'm doing is reading other people that say, yeah, you loved the same movies I love, I don't feel insulted if someone tells me a film that I love, that I'm passionate about, is the worst movie ever made, because it has nothing to do with me. It's a reflection of that person. So I also like to read critics whose opinions differ from my own, just because it's an opportunity to learn something. Mm-hmm. You know, I think we've lost the ability to, especially if you look on Facebook post this election, we've lost the ability to listen to each other. And I've always been of the mind of like, you know, I'm not going to learn anything if I don't listen to someone whose opinion differs from my own, or whose experience differs from my own. You know, I think we're as you know, as a country, we're living in too many different bubbles. We need to burst all these bubbles and listen to each other. So I certainly have made that my habit when it comes to, you know, reading about entertainment. And I think you know, we would all benefit from doing that on the political spectrum as well. Yeah,
I agree. I think agreeing to disagree is all of a sudden out of vogue. But, you know, in the earlier days, you had a pretty good eye as far as the young filmmakers on the rise. Can you talk a little bit of maybe filmmakers you've spotted in recent months? So you said, hey, I hope he or she really kind of gets a bigger audience because they deserve it, or maybe just any sort of inkling that there's sort of a new generation of talent that's coming?
Oh, yeah. Well, there's, I mean, I can tell you about a couple specific movies I've seen that you can look up later. One is a documentary called Haunters by a director named John Schnitzer. And John spent years working on this documentary about haunted houses. You know those like haunted houses that people set up, and sometimes they do them in neighborhoods. Sometimes there's real professional ones. They're called haunts, right? It's like haunt season. This is a seasonal job that people do. That some people work on this stuff year round. So it's an entire documentary about one particular maze where this guy kind of, you know, basically almost got himself in trouble with the law over like just how scary this haunted house was. It's a great documentary. It hasn't even come out on the festival circuit. Another was a movie that came out last year that still hasn't been released by a guy named Adam Rifkin, and the movie is called Director's Cut. And it's not a documentary, it's a narrative film, which appears as if it's about a typical cop thriller that we've seen a million times before, but it's really about a guy who kidnaps the lead actress from that movie to remake the movie starring himself. Huh. And it's one of the weirdest. You can look it up. I'm telling you, do yourself a favor, go on YouTube, look up Director's Cut trailer, watch the trailer, it's 3 minutes, and it's hysterical. It stars Penn Jillette. And it's really worth seeing.
Gotcha. I remember hearing that the beginning of that particular project, but I was kind of looking forward to seeing what happened to it. So, well, very cool. We'll kind of share that information on the show on the notes as well. You know, to play devil's advocate, you could say you've got one film site. It can only do so much. It only has so much clout. But I think through the years, you can maybe point to otherwise and sort of examples of where your site, your magazine, your publication did something and sort of affected either a filmmaker's life or something. Looking at 2017, what's sort of your grand ambition for Film Threat? What do you want it to do that other sites just aren't doing?
Well, at this point, what we're planning to do is we're expanding our podcast, right? So we have the Film Threat podcast, which comes out every week on Thursdays. What we're also planning to do is to expand into a podcast network. So Film Threat's not just a website like a movie blog; it's a media company. Mm-hmm. So what we'll be doing is putting out other sorts of merchandise that's Film Threat branded. But in addition to that, starting this podcast network, and the podcast network will sort of delve in different areas of film. We've got one of the podcasts is called Bears on Film, where two gay men review movies.
Okay.
One of the podcasts is called All the President's Movies, and it's about all the movies that have screened at the White House. Huh. And the person who's hosting that podcast is named Tom Gully. He's a political commentator and a radio host from Dallas, Texas. And I've known him for years. And what he'll do is each episode he'll review a film that was screened at the White House, talk about what president requested that this movie be screened, what was happening politically at the time, what lessons that particular president may have gleaned from watching the movie. Because this is public information. All movies that are screened at the White House screening room that information is made public. Bill Clinton was famously a big movie fan and even appeared with Roger Ebert on an episode of his television show. So it'll bounce back and forth between modern presidents, obviously President Trump, who screened Finding Dory recently, and then just going through all the different presidents, different sort of highlights, what was happening, like maybe there was some crisis happening and then a film was screened. So I think that that'll be All the President's Movie will probably be one of our more popular podcasts. But it's really spinning those podcasts off because each of those podcasts could also spin off into books or television shows. So we're actually in development on a Film Threat television show at the moment. So it's really sort of spinning off this movie blog into other media ventures, and I think the podcast network will be a big part of it. I'm really excited about this All the President's Movies podcast.
Excellent.
So, and you're the first person I've told about it, like, publicly. So
very cool.
So this is the announcement.
All right.
Which is kind of cool.
Excellent. Well, before I let you go, we often ask guests what kind of recommendations they can offer, sort of things that are under the radar. And that's exactly what you do with your site. But also, because you mentioned a couple of films, maybe there's a TV show or even an album or a new book you've been reading, anything that you kind of sort of on your nightstand or in your sort of Netflix queue that you could recommend?
Oh gosh, boy. That's a good one. I would. Well, here's a book that I think is timely, that I think would be good, is a book called The Influencing Machine. It's Brooke Gladstone on the media, and it's a really interesting book that sort of breaks apart the media in it's in comic book format, and it really just talks about the media's influence and whatnot, and how it's used well and misused. But it's effectively like a comic book that simply explains that. It's The Influencing Machine by Brooke Glad. That's illustrated by Josh Neufeld, but Brooke Gladstone.
Excellent.
So seek that one out.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, Chris. The site, of course, is filmthreat.com and the growing podcast empire, which you can look forward to. We will check out all the information on hollywoodintoto.com, the show notes. Just go to hollywoodintoto.com/Chris-Gore, and you'll have all the info there. Thanks again, Chris. Let's stay in touch, and maybe we'll check in down the road and find out how the empire is growing.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks again. Well, thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out hollywoodintoto.com for both the show notes and, of course, the latest entertainment news. Please follow me at Twitter at hollywoodintoto. And we'd love it if you leave a podcast review over at iTunes. See you next week.